everyone can hear me okay. Great, okay. I'm Lizzie Meager, a freelance journalist, and I'd like to introduce Julia Reinaud, a senior director at Breakthrough Energy in Paris. Breakthrough Energy is a global investment firm founded by Bill Gates, which is financing, launching, and scaling critical solutions the world needs to reach net zero emissions. So we're going to get straight into it. We don't have too long this morning. Julia, what has your experience at Breakthrough Energy taught you about financing nascent clean energy technologies?
Thank you so much, Lizzie, and good morning, everyone. It's quite an experience to speak on headphones and see you all with very shiny headsets on your ears. So I've been with Breakthrough for 6 years, and when we were founded by Bill Gates in 2015 at the Paris COP, our mission still is and still remains to be how do we accelerate the development and the deployment of technologies we most need to reach net zero. And across that journey, really think about how do we scale those technologies in order to be able to bring down the cost, so the economies of scale. Our whole premise is thinking about what we call the green premium, so how do we make these green technologies as affordable as brown technologies? And across the journey, what is the type of support that we need to bring to technologies that honestly don't have the same stage of maturity? Those that are still in the lab won't require the same type of financing as those that are ready for scaling. So what we're looking at is very much around the technology innovation, and we're thinking about how do we finance these technologies. And here we think across the 3 Ds, and we also look around what type of public, private, and philanthropic sources of capital we can think of. The first D is when a technology is still in a lab. We have many of those still in the UK labs, for instance. But the first type of funding for this discovery phase is really what we think in terms of grant funding. And so we'll think about sizable public grants in the UK from DESNZ and from Department of Transport. In the US, it'll be from different sources of funding, and in the EU, it'll be Horizon Europe. And here, this targeted grant funding is really what is necessary to be able to help bring another step ahead in terms of technology milestones. We've set up a philanthropic program called Fellows, where we've supported 90 innovation fellows and matched them with business fellows to help them think through how do they go from that stage of maturity, which is still perhaps in a lab, all the way to the pilot phase. Then comes the second stage of a maturity of a technology when it's ready to be developed. And here, our Breakthrough Energy team has developed a venture fund, and so we have several funds, but it's essentially required to be able to provide patient capital for the hardware type deep tech companies that we're supporting, and equally to focus on how do we focus on the impact that they have and to be able to scale that. So our venture funds has invested in over 120 companies that are in their seed and Series A, and then there's a follow-on fund called Select, which invests in their further growth stage. But it wouldn't be true to sort of look at where is the journey from a climate and technology perspective if we aren't focused on those technologies that have developed but really need to be deployed. So think of where solar was perhaps 15 or 30 years ago even, looking at technologies like sustainable aviation fuels, green hydrogen, storage solutions, where here we're at the demonstration phase and or first commercial, what we call first of a kind. And here again, we think that the type of financing that's required to unlock these projects, which still have an enormous amount of different types of risk, the type of financing required isn't the same. So here we have a project finance infrastructure type of fund that provides catalytic capital in the form of blended finance. So we play in a role that governments are playing with us, which is being able to provide equity, but also to be able to provide grants depending on the type of project and depending on whether there's a premium. And so throughout our journey, we've been working with a number of private sector actors that have been, and individuals who've provided funding to these different types of funds, but equally with the public sector that has a critical role to play in being able to mobilize funds for these different types of technologies. So 3 Ds are pretty important in terms of how we look at things. And last but not least, we're not just looking at it the perspective of technology and finance. We're also looking at it from the perspective that you need to have the right policy environment and you need to have the right collaborations with the public sector, but also throughout the private sector, be that with the insurance companies, be that with the off-takers from a corporate side, and be that with the many type of private sector categories that we can envisage.
Yeah, and I mean, everything that you've just said, I do think that Breakthrough Energy is really quite unique, and its USP is this willingness to get involved in these incredibly early stage technologies.
Absolutely.
That I think a lot of investors wouldn't touch, maybe can't touch. What can other investors take from Breakthrough's model as inspiration?
That's a great question. So the way I describe it, and it's perhaps more that we have a wholesale and sort of Swiss Army knife approach, again, depending on what is needed and what is necessary for a technology to develop, including, for example, if it's offtake agreements, because these projects aren't yet bankable. So I think from where I stand and looking at what we've been doing, I think that there's an incredible amount. Sort of we published our State of the Transition report at the COP in Dubai, where we sort of took stock of our 8 years of existence at Breakthrough Energy. I mentioned here we've invested in over 120 companies, so there's sort of a journey where, in 2015, there was the precedence of a clean tech 1.0 that really hadn't that been successful in terms of supporting these clean tech companies in the year 2000s. But when we started with Breakthrough Energy and the venture fund, really thinking about, lessons learned of how you would do venture funding for these clean tech is thinking about patient capital, thinking about deep tech, thinking about hardware solutions, thinking first and foremost, of course, about the team. So thinking about how do you set up some type of venture fund that is actually tailored to the needs of these clean tech companies from the earliest stages. But then, from the journey of where we stand, we're looking at what we call our acceleration buttons. Where do we need to double down in order to be able to bring our climate journey to where it needs to be by net zero? And that starts by thinking about electrification. That's going to be the cheapest option in most cases. So thinking not only about storage solutions that go on par with renewables, but also the grids. Second sort of fast forward button is the green molecules. How do we have green hydrogen? How do we have other sources of molecules that will be able to decarbonize when you can't electrify? And third is really around carbon management. And the challenge that we see in those fast forward buttons or acceleration buttons is really this question of scaling. To be able to rise to the scale of the challenge, we need to rise to the challenge of scale. And that's where thinking really again about how do we think about blended finance? How do we bring corporates, philanthropists, governments together to be able to first and foremost sort of address and assess what are the different types of risks that comes with these first of a kind projects, right? It's going to be technology risk, it's going to be construction risk, it's going to be feedstock risk, revenue risk, and then be able to size those risks and then allocate those to a whole of a collaborative sort of value chain approach. Corporates have a big deal in sort of taking, or even governments in terms of offtake agreement. On the technology side, what is the role of tech companies, of course, but what is also the role of insurance companies? And the list goes on. So the point being is for these first of a kind technologies, I certainly really see those as an asset class of its own that require not just a project developer to work on its own, but really to have all of the technology, all of the value chain together to be able to address what are the challenges to be able to unlock these final investment decisions.
Can you hear? Yeah, okay. And obviously, private investment is crucial to developing and scaling this clean tech, but investors are not going to save the world on their own. I wondered what exactly is the role you see policymakers playing in this, and how well are they doing at the moment?
Of course, well, perhaps I start with sort of first and foremost is like setting the ground rules, right? What are the targets? What are the mandates? And all of the other elements that can set business confidence for there to be an actual transition. I can say living in Paris, but also being part of the Europe team, we're incredibly lucky to have in the climate law a 2050 net zero target. But of course, targets and mandates won't mean final investment decisions. So I think just being able to ensure that the confidence from the investor to investors that there won't be a backtracking. I think what happened last year in the autumn statement in the case of the UK, backtracking on ICE cars being sold or heat pumps is not the best to be able to provide and instill that confidence, but nonetheless there is the Climate Change Committee and so that's sort of the framing. Second, I certainly think that there's a lot to be done around that red taping. How do we unlock sort of the permitting? How do we make sure that there's connections to the grid? How do we make sure that there's access to the feedstock and to the infrastructure that's required? So second really is to be able to inform and fast track that red tape unlocking. third, I'd say, is really around the business case, right? It's one thing to have renewable targets, it's another to make sure that there's actual investable proposition to have storage go on par with that renewable energy. Another sort of course, business case is around sustainable aviation fuels. We work very closely with the Green Finance Institute in the UK. How do we create a business case for there to be investments in sustainable aviation fuel projects? Same around green hydrogen. So that third element around the business case is incredibly important. And last but not least, coming back to this idea of, well, everyone has a role to play when it comes to de-risking investments and driving demand. And when we think about, our Western economies are have very high public deficits. And so thinking about how we can collectively make best use of where there are scarce public budgets in order to better unlock and crowd in private sector finance. So that's what I'd call that blended finance element, or other elements around guarantees that are absolutely critical to drive in more private sector finance.
And how well are governments doing at that at the moment?
I think there are some front runners and there are some areas where we're making good progress. I think just one example of a slow progress that finally materialized, again, I'm based, what we're looking at is more Brussels legislation, but it took 2 years to define, how do you define what green hydrogen is, right? And there are other economies where in the US they're still working around that. I think being able to first define what a green product is, then being aware of this issue of permitting. Again, in the UK, at the autumn statement, there was some progress made around how do you drive down the timelines for connecting to the grid and doing those major refurbishments of the grid. Again, we're making progress, but we're still definitely not where we need to be in order to have these investments that are going to take 2, 3, 4 years to construct when we're talking about heavy assets in order to be in time for our 2030 goals, and then to be able to set the scene for, and the types of confidence that investors need in order to be on track for that 2050 net zero goal. So we're making progress, but we really need to double down on that acceleration button.
Run, don't walk. Julia, thank you so much. I think that's all we have time for. I wasn't sure how the questions Slido situation might be going, and we covered a huge amount there. So if anyone does have questions for Julia, I'm sure she's available afterwards. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lizzie. Thank you, everyone.